Hey guys, it's Ivan. Today is a special day as we're introducing new 2.0 firmware for the ground control that adds functionality for the external CV inputs, the modulation output track, and scales. Today I'll go over how you can use the 4 external CV inputs to modulate various parameters on the ground control, how you can program velocity per step or modulation for the modulation output, and also how you can use and edit your own scales for the 3 melodic tracks. Let's start off by going over how you can assign the external CV inputs to modulate various parameters on the ground control. So first of all, if you want to assign CV input 1, you have to first select track D and then press tempo and external CV. Over here, using the page or pattern buttons, you can select the destination, for example, shift the pattern, semitones, octaves, shuffle, probability, ratcheting, slide amount, gate lengths, CC unipolar and CC bipolar, and you can also modulate the pattern. So if you want to assign CV number 2, you just have to switch to track 1, and now you have the destinations for CV2. Same applies for CV3, you select track 2, and for CV4, you select track 3. Apart from selecting the different destinations, for example, shift, semitone, octaves, shuffle, and others, you can also assign to which track this is going to be assigned to. So for example, let's select something that can be used by both the drum tracks and the melodic tracks, for example, ratcheting. Then you press the value buttons to assign it to track D1, which is the first output on the drum track, D2, D3, and until D8. And then you go to track 1, which is the melodic track, track 2, which is also melodic track, and track 3. Now let's assign external CV to modulate one of the parameters on the drum track D for the trigger number 3. So for example, first let's hear the pattern that I have prepared over here. As you can see, it's fairly basic. Let's stop the sequence. So now we take out a cycling envelope, which is a bipolar envelope from the ground terminal, and plug it inside of the external CV input 1. So next, let's play a pattern so we hear how this is going to be affected. Now we select tempo, external CV, cycle. For example, let's shift this pattern. First we select shift as destination, and then using the value buttons, we select drum 3. So what shift is doing is it is nudging the pattern forward and backwards. And this way you can create very interesting variations of very simple patterns. Now let's try to do the same and assign this external CV to modulate the probability. So again, track D is CV1, tempo, external CV, and we go to probability on drum 3. So now as the value over here gets higher, the probability of the track, the chance of triggering the track is getting smaller. Now let's try to assign a different parameter to modulate the track 3 on the drum track. So let's take again the same cycling envelope, and just to show you how you can assign CV2 to drum track, we just plug in a cable to CV2, select track 1 as this will be assigning the CV input 2, then tempo, external CV, and let's try to modulate the shuffle amount. Let's unplug and hear the pattern first. Then let's plug it in here, external CV, shuffle, and I want to assign this to drum track. So as you can see, it's modulating the shuffle amount, which might not be very useful all the time, but you can still make very interesting patterns with it. Now let's see how you can modulate the ratcheting with external CV. For this purpose, we'll be using the total recall, as it is very easy to manually control a voltage level. So first, in order to modulate ratcheting, you have to have steps that have ratchet in the sequence. So for example, we'll just use the hi-hat over here. We enter the SH101 mode and just enter some steps and enable ratcheting for others. So now we have the sequence with ratcheting amount equals to 0. Then we have to go to track D, which will select the CV input 1, external CV, ratchet amount, and map it to drum number 4. So now let's plug our cable. As the voltage is 0, we get 0 ratcheting, and as we go up, we should hear up to 4 ratchets on the steps that have ratcheting enabled. Let's decrease it. And now let's combine this with shifting the pattern. So we will switch to track 1, which will assign CV input 2. Then go to external CV, shuffle, but we need a shift and assign it to drum number 4. So this way, then you can use, for example, CV input 3 to modulate the probability or any other parameter that you want. Now that we've checked how you can assign external CV voltages to modulate the drum tracks, let's switch over to the melodic tracks, as they have some special assignments such as semitone, octaves, and others. Let's start a sequence that I have prepared on the CV output 1, which is a gold split going to the ground terminal with its filter. So, very simple. So now, let's switch to track D, as we'll be assigning CV input 1, external CV, and let's try to modulate the semitone amount to track 1. This works in a similar way as a quantizer, so any voltage read of the external CV input will be quantized to the step where the sequence is happening. So for example, let's plug it over. So in a way, if you, for example, activate every single step in a sequence, or let's say you have a trigger sequence inside of your melodic track, you can use external CV voltage to and quantize it and output over the melodic tracks on the ground control. For example, let's now feed an LFO. Maybe unipolar is better. Now let's use the voltage from the total recall and modulate the octave of this sequence. So to do that, we'll have to assign the CV input 2. Again, tempo, external CV, scroll to octaves, to track 1. So now let's play the sequence. Maybe bipolar over here works better. To understand that it's a bit easier, let's disconnect this LFO. And now we can use external voltage as your octave shifter. Let's try this with an envelope. These tricks are very useful if you have a very static sequence and you just want to modulate it, or if you want to go in a more generative direction, ground control will let you do all of it. The same way as you can modulate any other parameters such as ratcheting, probability, semitone, and octaves, you can also modulate the slide time and gate time. So the way this works, if you have a gate value set to 50%, the moment you plug any external CV input to modulate the gate amount, this offset, internal offset, is going to be ignored and completely overwritten by the external CV voltage. The last but not least feature of the external CV assignment or modulation matrix is ability to convert the voltages into CC values and transmit them over MIDI channels selected by either track D, 1, 2, or 3. So for example, if your track D is set to channel number 10, the CC value is going to be sent on channel number 10. So first, we select tempo, external CV, and then scroll to the left, we have pattern, and then we have CC unipolar or CC bipolar. And so for example, let's select CC unipolar, and then using the values, you select the CC number, and this can be from 0 to 128 over here. And this value is going to scale the full range of 0 to 5 or minus 5 to 5 volt to 0 to 127 value of the MIDI CC message. Now that you have seen how you can use external CV inputs to modulate any parameter on any track on the ground control, let me show you how you can use the modulation output. So first of all, what can modulation output do? The first thing is you can program velocity to be outputted from a specific track on the modulation output, or it can be defaulted to CC number 1, so you can plug an external keyboard and use your modulation wheel to output voltage out of the modulation output. To show you a good example how you can program velocity and use that to modulate a parameter, over here I have prepared a simple pattern. Every 16th note is being triggered for the 2 of cups, and I will be using the velocity output to modulate the sample select on the 2 of cups. By default, velocity is set to 127 or the maximum value. So if we start the sequence, now we have a different sample. Next one up, we have to press tempo, modulation output. Then by using the buttons over here, you can select from which track this velocity value is going to be transmitted to the modulation track. And over here, using the pattern buttons, you can select whether it's going to be unipolar or bipolar. So we'll select unipolar on track 3, exit, so we are playing this pattern. Then we'll press the record button to enter the editor of the sequence and press velocity. So now we can use the pattern buttons to switch between different steps, and we can use the keyboard to set the velocity value, or you can use the plus or minus sign to adjust by a value of 1. So let's say step 1 will be here. As you can hear, it's repeating. So now I'm just scrolling through steps and setting random values. So now we have this modulation output modulating the sample on the 2 of cups. So now let's deactivate, I also have a kick. Let's offset that. And now let's also shift this value using the bipolar LFO. I mean, shifting the pattern. So first, track D, external CV, and we want to shift the pattern on track 3. Let's go back over here. Let's unmute this. Let's adjust the shuffle a bit. Again, maybe we want to edit the pattern. So number 3. Let's adjust the pitch. So as you can see, from a very simple pattern we can introduce a lot of variation using the external CV inputs and also using the velocity values to modulate various parameters in your patch. Now that you understand how to use external CV inputs and modulation output, the final stage is the scales. The scales can only be applied to the 3 melodic tracks, and to apply them, so for example now we have a simple chromatic scale on track 1, you have to press tempo and scale, and over here you can select chromatic, major, minor, Lydian, and other scales. You also have a custom scale in here where you can select what note to be selected inside of the scale or which one you don't want to be selected. The selected ones are shown by the dimly lit LEDs over here. And also, if for example I go to a chromatic scale and I want to take out these 3 notes, the moment I take them out, the sequencer switches to the custom scale, so it already knows that you're editing it. This way it's easier for you to start somewhere where the melodic content is already working, and you, for example, just want to deselect one note and save it as your own custom scale. If we're inside of the chromatic scale, we can play any note on this keyboard, but the moment you shift or switch to a different scale, for example, Lydian is one of my favorite ones, if you select it, you can no longer play every single note. So for example, if I press C, it's C. If I press C sharp, it switches to D, and so on. So the notes that are not part of the scale are forced to be inside of the scale, and this way you can never have like moments of silence where you're recording a sequence, and it works very well for live situations. So now let me show you how you can use the scales on the fly. So for example, let's start the sequence and record something random. Now we go to scales, major pentatonic, I quite like this one, so now we can unmute our drums. Now, for example, we're in this scale and I want to edit some notes out. This way. So you can, on the fly, select and deselect different notes from your scale, and this way you can modulate your pattern. Now that we have covered how you can use the external CV inputs, the modulation output, and the scales, let's try to combine all of this and have a little jam. So let's start the sequence. Now I would like to modulate the octave of the track 1, aka the bass line. So for that, I will be taking the envelope over here, plugging it inside of the total recall, and using total recall to attenuate this voltage. Then I want to assign CV input 2 to modulate the octave. So to do that, you switch to track 1, external CV in octave, and here select track 1. So now we can go higher. Now I would also like to have some fill patterns on the snare drum, which is drum number 2. So to do that, I will be using the envelope from the bass line, which is bipolar, and sending it to CV input 3. So to do that, we switch to track 2, which will be CV3, external CV, select shift, and select drum number 2. Now let's play around with the scale and deactivate some notes. For example, now we're in Lydian. We have to switch to track number 1 to do that. So we select Lydian. I want to record the sequence in here. Now switching the scale over here. I hope you enjoyed this little tutorial video on the 2.0 firmware. As you can see, it really pushes the boundaries at what ground control can do. For example, you can use CV inputs to modulate any parameter. You can also now use CV inputs to convert them to CC values, which basically makes a ground control a CV to MIDI converter. You can also use CV inputs to modulate parameters such as, for example, octaves. So this way you can add extra controls to modulate different parameters inside of ground control and be ready for performance without having to go into different menus to activate or deactivate various things. Next, we have the modulation output that lets you program velocity per step, and it converts that to a voltage, so you can use that as your extra CV track, but it doesn't track 1 volt per octave. And now we have a scale mode, which means that if you play something live on the keyboard, you will never hit a wrong note, but also it adds an extra layer of improvisation where, let's say you have a sequence running on track 1, and then you can go over here and select and deselect different notes on the fly, which will bring more variation to your sequence while keeping the original rhythm intact. Let us know what is your favorite feature of the new 2.0 firmware. If you have any questions, you can always write to us in the support or in the comment section, and we'll get back to you as soon as possible. And that's it for today. Until next time.